Millions of years ago, there came the first dawn of a new land. It was the birth of Australia. From its primeval origins, Australia became a land like nowhere else on Earth. A land of contrast, revealing its antiquity in a display of marvelous landscapes. Over long periods of time, this vast landmass transformed into a fertile oasis, and from it evolved an array of splendid forests. Today, such forests are prosperous habitats, and these are the homes for one of Australia's most prized possessions. The beautiful animals of Australia have developed differently from those elsewhere, because they were isolated from the rest of the world for millions of years. This has resulted in a unique collection of animals, a multitude of wondrous creatures. Having evolved in isolation, it was the mammals that inherited the kingdom of the land. The birds that became the rulers of the skies, the aquatic animals that dominated the inland waters. However, a later intruder was to change all this forever. In a very short period of time, humans have changed the face of Australia. By dominating the living space and exploiting the natural resources, our own species has changed the destiny of all other animals. Today, it is we who pose the greatest single threat to the survival of Australia's animals. Whereas the native animals had the whole continent to themselves for millions of years, today they are forced to share the environment with humans, and some are barely hanging on. Many have been pushed out of their habitats, having fallen victim to the pressures on them by human encroachment. This is the story of the effects that people have had on the native animals of Australia. With the passage of time, humans have created their own habitats, and these monuments reflect the legacy of 20th century living. Our story of human impact goes back to a time when the only monuments were the rocks, and it was on these that the first people of Australia left their mark. The Aborigines have been in Australia for at least 40,000 years. It appears they lived in harmony with the animals, which, as their paintings show, became an integral part of their mythology. However, the Aborigines ended the domination the animals had held for millions of years. All of a sudden, there was a new threat in the bush. For the first time, the animals faced a direct assault by people. The Aborigines employed a skillful form of hunting involving group attacks. Many species would have suffered from such organized onslaughts. These people also use something else to assist their hunting. Having witnessed natural fires for thousands of years, the Aborigines learnt to use fire as an environmental tool. By deliberately burning selected vegetation and waiting for the fresh growth to regenerate, the Aborigines enticed animals to an area where they could be readily hunted. With the death of the fire and the birth of vegetation, the animals move in, oblivious to their fate. Exactly how Australia's animals were affected by the Aborigines will never be known, but it seems they caused extinctions, either by hunting or by altering the environment through burning. By going deep under the earth, we find evidence of the largest animals that ever lived in Australia, the megafauna. Giant versions of wombats, kangaroos and goannas once roamed the land, but in contrast to their past glory, are today entombed, only as fossils. Possibly the early Aborigines contributed to their extinction, but whether responsible or not, with the death of the megafauna, a magnificent era passed into history. A new sound invaded this silent land. Long ago, Aboriginal groups from the north reached the shores of Australia. They had on board a number of animals bred from the wild dogs of Asia. These were the ancestors of the dingo. Until this time, no wild dog existed in this peaceful land. The dingo, unable to resist the temptation, soon broke the leash with its masters to run free. Here was a land teeming with all manner of birds and beasts that knew no fear of dogs. The dingo had been delivered into a paradise. Food was everywhere. This new world was like a canine supermarket with goods just waiting to be wolfed down. The first dingoes in this land couldn't believe their luck. There was no serious competition, and life was one big game. The As dingoes multiplied, some had to leave the coast in search of new territories inland. The assault on the native fauna began in earnest. No animal was safe from this stealthy marauder. Dingoes work as a pack to prey on large game. Together they are able to catch and kill the biggest of kangaroos. This carnivore had an enormous impact on the native wildlife of Australia. Because of its size and power, it had no need to fear any other predator. Ironically, the animals that suffered most from the dingo invasion were not those which dingoes killed. The Tasmanian devil competed with the dingo and was driven to extinction on the mainland. The dingo never made it to Tasmania, the devil's last refuge. To be pushed around in your own country is enough to frustrate anyone. An animal resembling the dingo once lived all over Australia, the Tasmanian tiger. It too was in deadly competition with the dingo and was wiped off the mainland by this invading predator. No single event in the history of Australian animals had such a profound effect as one that occurred a mere 200 years ago. Europeans set foot on Australian soil. Of explorers and settlers had a heavy impact on the land as it was cleared for introduced livestock and crops. Trees which shaded the grass were attacked with axes, for it was grass that grew the golden fleece. Sheep flocks spilled in waves over the hills to pour onto the inland plains. Because of the greed for grass, there were very few areas where sheep and cattle were not run. Grass wasn't just grazed, it was mined. And the environment suffered. All types of bizarre beasts of burden were introduced into Australia. These exotic creatures were soon set free or escaped to turn feral. These alien animals survive as well as any native animal, except they are 10 times bigger than the biggest. The adaptable donkey has taken Australia in its stride. This hardy beast was well prepared for the harsh conditions it met in its new land. The other common beast of burden to add its weight to all the herds of intruding animals was the brumby. As if Australia did not have enough cattle, the buffalo had to be imported from Indonesia. It would fare well where no other introduced animal could, in the tropical swamp country of Australia. This gentle-looking giant wasn't so gentle on the environment. The buffalo had the country licked, but a far heavier impact was made by a much smaller import. Early immigrants dreamed of having rabbits for sport in their new land. The dream came true, but turned to a nightmare. Populations exploded because of lack of natural predators, with one exception. Rabbits could outbreed any level of predation and spread throughout most of the country. The humble little rabbit joined the other weird and wonderful animal introductions. The combined effects of grazing by all the exotic animals meant devastation of the natural environment. For the native animals, the consequences were severe. The land they needed was either cleared by people or destroyed by introduced animals. Many species were driven to the edge of extinction. The loss of its habitat spelt disaster for one Australian animal. The numbat has suffered a drastic decline. Once widespread throughout much of the continent, this enchanting marsupial is now rare and only found in a small area of Western Australia. Fortunately, enough of the numbat's habitat has been spared, and the future looks promising for one of Australia's most unique and beautiful marsupials. Forest clearing has resulted in another casualty. The wombenga was once common, but now is confined to only a few isolated reserves. With much of its habitat destroyed, these forests are its last refuge. The eastern native cat was a victim of more than just clearing. It was stricken by a disease, probably brought in by introduced animals. Once abundant all over eastern Australia, this native cat is now extinct on the mainland and only found in Tasmania. One Australian threatened by habitat destruction is the mallee fowl. To incubate its eggs, this remarkable bird builds a nest 4 meters across and 1 meter high. An awesome task. Only occasionally helped by the female, the male mallee fowl spends 9 months a year laboriously kicking soil. This makes him one of the hardest workers in the whole of Australia. Despite all this hard work, the mallee fowl is sinking into oblivion, and its future seems obscure. The early settlers also introduced predators, the domestic dog, the common cat, and worst of all, the cunning fox. Brought in originally for sport, today the fox causes chaos amongst the animals. The fox torments many Australian birds. The majestic brogger lays its eggs in grassy swamps, and these are easy prey for such an opportunistic carnivore. This unique Australian bird lives in peril of the fox. Another casualty of fox predation is the brush-tailed bettong. Already restricted by clearing and grazing, this delicate marsupial suffered further as a result of the fox. Today, with only a few hundred individuals remaining, the brush-tailed bettong is sadly one of Australia's most endangered animals. Not all the animals accompanying the early settlers were brought in deliberately. Many were uninvited passengers on ships or drifted in on the wreckage of lost boats. Amongst these accidental introductions were the notorious black and brown rats. Having survived the treacherous seas, these resolute rodents moved inland and spread amazingly quickly. They soon became a threat to the native animals, not just through competition, but because they carried disease. Another intruder is the house mouse. Accompanying us wherever we go, this little creature can survive in any environment we can, and in some we can't. The house mouse is abundant all over the world and has earned the reputation as Australia's most common mammal. The house mouse is probably responsible for the decline of some of the native hopping mice. These delicate desert rodents face fierce competition for food and living space from the more robust house mouse. So the early settlers endowed Australia with a whole new menagerie. Those beasts that really became burdens, and the little ones that were just good sports. Then there were those that were uninvited, those that were very welcome, and a whole variety of others that didn't know whether they were coming or going. As if this wasn't enough, there was also the ferret, and would you believe it, the ostrich. so many strange-looking creatures running amok in the Australian countryside, it makes you wonder what the native animals must have thought of it all. Of all the animals introduced, perhaps the most ridiculous was a toad. The South American cane toad was brought into Australia to prey on the cane beetles, which were ravaging the sugar crops. However, the cane toad became an environmental menace because it secretes a poison that kills almost anything that tries to eat it. The original 101 individuals introduced have multiplied into millions, and the cane toad invasion is virtually unstoppable. The European settlers had yet another effect on Australia's animals. Quite simply, they hunted some species to extinction. One such victim was the Tasmanian tiger. Maligned by farmers because it preyed on their sheep, the tiger was shot, trapped and poisoned until it was no longer a threat. Despite the realization of its drastic decline, government protection came much too late. The last known Tasmanian tiger died a prisoner. In only 100 years, we had destroyed 30 million years of evolution and the world's largest marsupial carnivore. The Tulagi wallaby was also cruelly driven to extinction for sport and because it wore such a beautiful coat. Having valuable fur was the cause for another Australian's demise. In the relentless pursuit by hunters, koalas were slaughtered in their millions. As a result, one of Australia's most loved animals nearly perished. Fortunately, the effects of such an onslaught were realized before it was too late, and koala hunting was stopped. However, even today, these beautiful animals have not established their former numbers. Perhaps of all the destruction caused by the early settlers, the direct assault of hunting is the most difficult to forgive. It was the combination of immense habitat destruction, introduced animals, and hunting that devastated Australia's animals. The European settlers caused more damage in only 200 years than the Aborigines had in 40,000. The destruction has left many animals extinct and many more endangered. It is the smaller creatures of the desert that have suffered the most. Why so many arid zone animals have perished is a mystery. Maybe the effects of European destruction were the last straw for these animals already living under very difficult conditions. Whatever the reasons, Australia has lost forever some of its most beautiful desert animals. It is ironic that it is in the same area where people inflicted the greatest harm that some species actually benefited. Many arid zone animals were protected from the harsh conditions because the early settlers made available something the desert very rarely had: water. Of all the animals, it was the red and grey kangaroos that prospered the most. Prior to European settlement, these marsupials would have had to endure severe droughts. But by bringing underground water to the surface, humans had unintentionally presented a gift for all the kangaroos to enjoy. Provided with the desert's most precious resource, these marvelous animals were assured survival. The final chapter of human impact brings us to the present and to a very different threat. In contrast to the past, the destructive effects of industry are more extensive, and Australia's wilderness pays the price. As the demand for resources increases, exploitation of the land intensifies. Unfortunately for Australia's animals, the effect is devastating. Today, the magnitude of habitat destruction is far greater than it was at the time of the early settlers. Already, Australia has lost 2/3 of its original forests. Perhaps the most disturbing of today's activities is the desecration of rainforests. In the last 200 years, much of Australia's unique tropical forest has been cleared. Now all that's left are a few remnants. With only 1/4 of these majestic forests still remaining, many animals are barely hanging on. The long-tailed pygmy possum can only live in these remaining forests. Today, rainforest clearing is the greatest threat to its survival. It is not just rainforest clearing that is endangering the animals. In the mountain ash forests, there is another casualty. The leadbeater's possum is threatened because it lives in a forest destined to be cleared. Only conservation of this area will ensure the survival of this rare and beautiful marsupial. Far away from the cold forests of the south are the warm waters of the Great Barrier Reef, the world's largest coral system. One of Australia's greatest treasures, the Barrier Reef is bursting with an abundance of life. One of the reef's largest inhabitants is the sea turtle. Turtles visit Australian beaches in an annual pilgrimage to lay their eggs away from the dangers of the sea. In a display of persistence, these magnificent animals set about their arduous task. Sadly, very few eggs hatch, as many fall victim to predation. But the turtle's greatest predator is man. In many parts of the world, turtles are endangered because they are ruthlessly hunted. Only in Australia are they relatively safe. What was once a vast wilderness is today scarred with the effects of people and their technology. Today, it is in the cities, with the effects of urbanization and industry, that the full force of human impact is most graphically displayed. Remarkably, many animals have survived this assault. Even in this, the most hostile of environments, animals have adapted, and some have even made the city their home. The urban dwellers exemplify the amazing adaptability of animals. No matter how much we modify an environment, some enterprising creature is willing to live there. Some animals have gone one better. They've not only adapted to our cities, but to us as well. Far from being displaced by encroachment, these animals have learnt to utilize us, and as a result, never go hungry. Uncannily, in the cities today, people and animals are coexisting with mutual benefits, and many species have learnt to live in harmony with their urban refuge. While most animals seek the sanctuary of slumber, the city is far from sleep. In a frenzied display, the city pulsates with activity, unaware that in its midst there lies a silent witness. Hidden in the shadows of this seemingly alien environment are the creatures of darkness. Only at night do they take the stage. The flying fox has benefited greatly from human settlements. In addition to native plants, these bats now enjoy a range of introduced fruits. By capitalizing on our activities, flying foxes are now a feature of many cities in Australia. One animal that must think our cities are a paradise is the brush-tailed possum, the reason being it's surrounded by food. Already capable of devouring a range of native foods, the delights supplied by people meant even more for the taking. Lured by its ravenous appetite and its rather extensive menu, perhaps these possums have become rather rapacious. As the sun rises, the possum's day approaches its end, and the panic for yet more food is on. With the dreaded thought of entering slumber hungry, these gluttons continue their relentless search for a meal. Far away from the cities, there are animals in trouble. However, someone is concerned. Once widespread, but mysteriously now rare, is a group of animals so evasive that radio is used to locate them. To help these animals survive, they have been bred in captivity and released into areas where they should find safe homes. The released animals are rarely seen, but they can't hide from the ears of radio. These elusive little creatures are bilbies, bandicoots that burrow. If the released bandicoots can breed and live safely in their new environment, it's possible that once again they will roam widely in the arid regions. Far from the western deserts lives a cousin of the bilby, the eastern barred bandicoot. This bandicoot is an endangered animal of the grasslands that has found refuge in an unlikely place, in a country town. The locals have recognized the rarity of their fellow resident and the hazards of its living in the suburbs. Being a fringe dweller, it is forced to live where no one else would, in all the unsavory parts of town. Cricketers and bandicoots, it's the oval they both want. By day, the cricketers play, but at night, the ground belongs to the bandicoots. They venture onto the field to dine on their underground menu of earthworms and insects. With community help, this rare bandicoot stands a good chance of surviving in its quiet country town retreat. On the bleakest mountains, throughout winter and summer, lives a possum that was once called the rarest animal in the world. A ski resort has been built right where it lives, and a road cuts through the habitat of this hardy little animal. The strange thing about these possums is that females live in one area, males in another, and they won't cross roads to mate. Naturally, the population decreased, until a tunnel was built under the road. An automatic camera caught male pygmy possums in the act, visiting the girls, then returning home. The camera captured other tunnel users, including one that would spell the end of a possum's night out. Foxes have now been shut out of the tunnel, and the possums are safe. In the breeding season, males are able to cross under the road to find females. The story of the mountain pygmy possum is one with a happy ending. With the help of a man-made tunnel of love, these rare little possums are free to mate and live their lives on the cold mountain peaks. Concealed in ancient rocks are clues to the mysterious past of Australia's animals. The story is just starting to be unraveled. The rocks reluctantly give up their secrets. Fossils that tell of extinctions of the distant past. The impact of humans has added to these extinctions, and some of our animals may only be known from their bones. But there are signs of hope. In a country as vast as Australia, there is every chance that animals exist that are yet to be discovered. In the last few years, animals have been found that were thought to be extinct, and only recently, new animals have been discovered. Australia seems a land without limit, yet the human impact has resulted in animals becoming threatened by loss of habitat. Optimism for the future of the animals lies in concern for their needs. If we can set aside natural areas for the animals of Australia, they stand a fighting chance to survive. Our caring will ensure their future.